The leather case had not been opened in 31 years, and the latches still knew how to resist. Calvin Rourke stood in the storage room of the Belmore County Arts Center on a Wednesday morning in November, holding a flashlight in one hand and a key he had not touched since 1993 in the other. The air in the room was cold and still, the particular stillness of a space that had been sealed long enough to forget what sound felt like. Against the far wall, beneath a canvas moving blanket gone gray with dust, was the shape he had been told about. Low and rectangular, roughly 6 feet long, on a wheeled platform that had not moved in 3 decades. Steinway Model D Concert Grand, serial number 289741, built in Hamburg in 1961. Adeline Hargrove stood behind him with her arms crossed, watching. She was 44 years old and had run the Belmore County Arts Center for the past 9 years with the same crisp competence she applied to everything. She wore a dark blazer and kept her expression neutral in the way of people who have learned to manage their reactions before audiences larger than one. "If you can tune it," she said, "and certify it concert-ready before the gala on Saturday, the Foundation's grant is yours." She paused. $250,000. Calvin did not respond immediately. He was looking at the shape under the canvas. "Mr. Rourke," Adeline said with the careful emphasis of someone accustomed to not repeating herself. "The other technicians we've contacted have all said the same thing. 31 years in uncontrolled storage. The soundboard is almost certainly cracked. The action is likely warped beyond practical adjustment. The strings will need full replacement, and even then." "The strings are fine," Calvin said quietly. Adeline stopped. "This instrument was prepared for long-term storage correctly," he said. "Someone detuned it to remove string tension before sealing the room. You can see it from the way the blanket drapes. The lid was closed and latched. The humidity in here runs cold and consistent." He lifted the edge of the canvas. "It's not fine, but the strings are fine." What he did not say, what none of them yet understood, was that he had been the last person to touch this piano. Calvin Rourke was 58 years old, and nothing about the exterior of his life suggested anything unusual. He woke at 5:45 most mornings in the small craftsman house on Aldrich Lane in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, where he had lived for 11 years since moving back from Philadelphia. He made coffee on the stovetop, the Italian kind, the way his wife Ellen had taught him when they were young and had more time than money and considered a good cup of coffee a form of extravagance. He drank it at the kitchen table and he listened. In the early years after Ellen died, the listening had been difficult because the house was full of sounds she was no longer making. Now 6 years on, he had learned to find the quiet useful. His daughter Mara appeared most mornings in a way that still surprised him, even though she had been living in the house for 4 months since her own apartment lease ended and she had not yet found a new one. She was 27, worked remotely in medical billing, and operated on a schedule 3 hours behind Calvin's. She materialized in the kitchen doorway around 9 with her hair tied up and a mug from the cabinet she had claimed as hers, a blue one with a chipped handle that had been Ellen's, and that Mara had quietly adopted without either of them naming what the gesture meant. On the morning of the 3rd Tuesday in October, she found him at the table with a phone call open on speaker and an expression she recognized as the one he wore when something had found him that he was not yet sure he wanted. He ended the call when she came in. "Was that work?" she asked. "An inquiry," he said. She poured her coffee and sat across from him and waited in the manner she had learned from watching him, which was that waiting without pressure was more useful than asking. "It's an instrument," he said finally. "A piano. At the Arts Center in Belmore. They found it in a storage room they've been using as overflow space for 30 years. Apparently, someone on their facilities staff noticed the room number in an inventory audit that hadn't been touched since 1992. Mara turned her mug in her hands. "What kind of piano?" "A Model D." He was quiet. "Concert Steinway. Hamburg build, 1961. She looked at him. "I serviced that piano," he said, "in 1993. For a performance series the center ran that year. It was the last job I completed before your mother and I moved to Philadelphia." He looked at his coffee. "When the series ended, the center's director at the time put the room into storage and it just stayed there. The room was never reassigned. The instrument was never transferred. It fell out of the institutional memory when the director retired. And now, they want someone to assess it." He paused. "Possibly restore it to playable condition for a gala they have this Saturday." Mara watched his face. "Are you going to do it?" Calvin stood up, took his mug to the sink and said, "I haven't done that kind of work in a long time." He had been, before Philadelphia and before the years that followed, one of the most respected concert instrument technicians in the northeastern United States. He had trained under a German-born master technician named August Voigt in the late 1980s, a man who had spent 20 years inside the Steinway Hamburg factory floor during its most productive period and who taught in the particular way of people who expected you to understand not just the instruction but the reasoning beneath it. August had told Calvin once, in the dry matter-of-fact way he had of saying things that turned out to matter, "You cannot fix what you have not listened to, and most people do not know how to listen to a piano." Calvin had been 26 and had found this advice too abstract to be immediately useful. By 35, he understood it completely. He had returned to Pennsylvania with those skills and built a quiet practice through referrals from concert venues, university music departments, and the occasional private collector. He worked on Steinway's, Bosendorfer's, Physiolis. He was not prominent in the way of people who appear in trade publications, but the people who needed his name had it. Then Ellen's diagnosis had come, and the work had reorganized itself around that fact, the way everything reorganizes itself around the thing that suddenly matters most. He reduced his client list to the nearest and most flexible. He turned down the Philadelphia Orchestra's seasonal contract 3 consecutive years, and eventually they stopped calling. After she died, he had kept working, but the high-end concert work had largely moved on without him, which was fine because he had not gone looking for it. He did regional tuning now, some regulation work for the community college, occasional consultations for church instruments. The salary covered the house and Mara's expenses while she regrouped, and in the evenings he sat in the back room where the upright piano stood against the north wall, a modest kawai that had been Mara's practice instrument when she was a girl, and sometimes he played, quietly, the kind of playing that is not for an audience. He had a locked cabinet in that room. Inside it were his master tools. The regulation kit August had assembled for him when he finished his training, the precision torque gauge he had built himself from specifications he'd found in a German journal, and a binder of technical notes spanning 30 years. He rarely opened the cabinet. He was not sure, some evenings, why he kept it closed rather than simply putting the things away in the ordinary tool storage with everything else. He was about to find out. The call from Adeline Hargrove had come through a former colleague named Pete Whitman, who had told her Calvin was possibly the only working technician in the Mid-Atlantic, with hands-on experience with Hamburg-era Model D instruments from the early 1960s. Pete had added, in his characteristically inexact way, that Calvin was semi-retired, sort of, which means he might say no. Calvin called Adeline back the next morning and said he would come to assess the instrument. He did not commit to anything beyond the assessment. The drive to Belmore was 40 minutes. He brought a flashlight, a basic kit, and the binder. When Adeline pulled back the canvas in the storage room and he saw the piano in full for the first time in 31 years, he stood still for a long moment. The case had gone dull, the lacquer clouded by decades of slow oxidation, the brass hardware green-edged at the joints. One of the casters had partially collapsed, tilting the instrument slightly toward the base end. The key cover was closed, but the structure of the case was intact. No visible cracks in the spruce. The lid was latched correctly, the way he had latched it. He crouched and opened the key cover. Beneath it, wedged into the recess between the fallboard and the front rail, was a folded sheet of paper. He reached in and drew it out. The paper had yellowed and gone brittle at the fold lines. His own handwriting, 31 years younger, looked up at him. Instrument prepared for long-term storage, 11-1493, string tension reduced by half-step intervals across all registers. Pin block condition, good, soundboard, no visible fractures, sustain consistent to 40 Hz, action regulated to 9.5 millimeters, see Rourke. He stood and placed the note on the lid of the piano. There's an assessment sheet, he told Adeline. I left it with the instrument when I closed the room. She looked at the note, then she looked at him. You were here before. I serviced this instrument for the 1993 concert series. He set down his kit and opened it. I prepared it for storage when the series ended. I believed it was going into short-term holding. The loaded silence in the room lasted for several seconds. Mr. Rourke, Adeline said carefully. That was 31 years ago. Yes, he said, and took out his tuning hammer. The assessment took 4 hours. Calvin worked through the instrument systematically, the way August had taught him. Strings first, then pin block, then soundboard, then action, then keys. No assumptions, no shortcuts, no conclusions formed before the evidence arrived. The strings were intact, as he had suspected. The tension reduction he had applied in 1993 had protected them from the pressure fatigue that destroyed most instruments in long storage. There was surface oxidation on the base wound strings, but the core wire was sound. The pin block, the laminated hardwood that anchored the tuning pins, was in better condition than any reasonable expectation would have predicted. The humidity in the closed room had remained low and stable over the decades, which was luck, or possibly the consequence of the room's particular placement in the building's basement level, insulated from seasonal variation by the concrete walls. The soundboard had a hairline fracture, one running 18 centimeters along the grain in the upper treble register, significant but not catastrophic. In instruments of this age and build quality, a single hairline in that location was addressable through a process of bridging and controlled humidity restoration. It would take time and precision. He had 3 days. The action, the mechanical system that translated the pressure of a pianist's fingers into the movement of hammers against strings, was dry and the regulation had drifted over decades. Every hammer shank needed inspection. The repetition levers had stiffened. The key bushings were compressed and uneven. It was, Calvin noted in his own mind as he worked through the inventory, a great deal of work for 3 days. He sat back on the bench and looked at the full length of the instrument in the storage room's overhead light. Adeline appeared at the door. Your assessment, the soundboard has a single fracture. The action needs full regulation. Voicing on the hammers will require attention after regulation is complete. The pin block is serviceable. I'll need to bring my full kit, a humidity stabilizer and access to the room for the next 3 days at minimum. Adeline waited. I can have it concert ready by Friday evening, Calvin said. She looked at him steadily. The other technician we contacted, Harmon Delaney out of Trenton, 30 years in the business, said it wasn't restorable in under 2 weeks without a complete action replacement. Parts would need to be sourced. Harmon is a good technician, Calvin said. He would have looked at the action and reached that conclusion correctly based on standard protocol. He turned back to the piano. Standard protocol would be to replace the action. I'm not going to do that, why not? He was quiet for a moment. Because the original action in a 1961 Hamburg Model D is not replaceable with a current production equivalent. The geometry is different. The key dip, the repetition spring weights, the hammer mass. These were calibrated to this soundboard over decades of use before the instrument went into storage. You can install a new action, it will function, but it will not be the same instrument. He ran his hand along the bass keys. The pianist who performs on Saturday night will hear the difference. Whether they know why, they will hear it. Adeline was quiet for a moment. You're saying the answer is to restore the original. I'm saying that's the only answer that preserves what this piano actually is. She held his gaze for a moment longer than the professional exchange required. Then, when can you start? He stood up. I already have. Mara called at 7 the first evening while Calvin was driving home to collect his full kit. How was it? Complicated, he said. Good complicated or bad complicated? He thought about it, the kind that's both. She was quiet for a moment. Dad, are you taking the job? I'm taking the assessment, he said. That's not what I asked. He pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment after the engine stopped. There's a soundboard fracture. The action needs full regulation. 3 days. Can you do it in 3 days? I don't know yet. Another pause, longer. When did you last do a full regulation on a concert instrument? He looked at the dark front of the house, the kitchen light on inside. 14 years, he said. Mara said nothing for a moment. Mom used to say your hands remembered things your brain forgot. He opened the car door. Your mother said a great many things that turned out to be correct. I know. A brief pause. I'll keep dinner warm. He came in and ate and afterward went to the back room and unlocked the cabinet and stood looking at the tools inside. The regulation kit, the torque gauge, the binder which was thick and worn at the spine. He had not opened it in years. He pulled it out and set it on the table under the lamp and opened it to the 1993 section. The notes were dense and precise, cross-referenced with small diagrams, measurements in millimeters, observations about this specific instrument. The kind of documentation that only happens when someone understands, even in the moment of writing, that it may one day matter. He sat down and began to read. The second day was the hardest. Calvin arrived at the Arts Center at 7 in the morning, before the administrative staff, led in by the facilities manager with a key card and no further ceremony. He worked through the action regulation with the methodical patience that August had beaten into him in the early years, not harshly, but in the way of teachers who do not accept approximation, because they understand what approximation costs. Every hammer shank, examined and adjusted, 73 hours more or less, if he was to get through all 88 keys before he needed to begin voicing. He did not check the clock. Checking the clock was a habit that belonged to different kinds of work. A man named Dennis Carr found him there at 10. Carr was the center's longtime house piano technician, a perfectly competent tuner who maintained the upright rehearsal instruments and had strong opinions about the renovation this old storage room had clearly been designed for. He stood at the door and looked at what Calvin was doing with the expression of someone who had arrived expecting to take over and was recalibrating. Harmon Delaney told Adeline the action was unsalvageable, Carr said. Harmon is right about what a standard replacement would look like, Calvin said without looking up. I'm not doing a standard replacement. I've been maintaining instruments here for 16 years, Carr said. His voice was carefully flat. I put a bid in to assess this piano before Adeline went external. Calvin set down the regulating tool and looked at him. I know. Pete Whitman mentioned it. I'm not here to compete with your work, Carr. I'm here because I serviced this specific instrument 30 years ago, and I have documentation that no one else has. A pause. If I can't make it work by Friday, this conversation becomes relevant. Until then, I'd appreciate the space. Carr looked at him for a long moment, then left. The real problem came at 2 in the afternoon, when Calvin identified the source of the soundboard fracture more precisely than his initial assessment had allowed. The hairline crack he had measured at 18 centimeters was, under the magnification lens, connected at its upper terminus to a stress point in the bridge cap, the strip of hardwood that transferred string vibration into the soundboard. The bridge cap itself was sound, but the glue joint at the fracture point had failed silently over decades, creating a microgap that would allow the crack to propagate under the string tension of full pitch. If he brought the instrument up to concert pitch without addressing the bridge cap joint first, the fracture would widen under the first hour of playing. The piano would be untenable by the time the gala started. He called Pete Whitman. I need hide glue, instrument grade, and a veneer clamp set with reach extensions. Who's closest? Pete was quiet for a beat. There's a luthier on Orchard Street in Scranton, Vic Rennert. He's semi-retired but still keeps a full shop. He made the clamp set you're describing from scratch for a cello restoration 2 years ago. He'll want to hear the problem before he hands anything over. Calvin drove to Scranton, explained the fracture geometry to Vic Rennert in exact terms, and stood in the man's workshop for an hour while Vic asked questions that only someone with real knowledge would think to ask. At the end of it, Vic handed over the clamps and a jar of hide glue he had mixed himself to the right viscosity and said, "Bring them back when you're done. I want to hear how it sounds." Calvin was back at the center by 6:00. The glue went in at 6:15, the clamps set by 6:30. He would need to wait 12 hours minimum before bringing any string tension onto the repaired section. He sat on the bench in the quiet storage room and looked at the piano clamped and waiting. The light in the room was a single overhead fluorescent that hummed at a frequency just below comfortable. He had been here for 11 hours. Mara called at 7:30. "Are you still there?" "Still here. I drove by on my way back from the pharmacy. Your car was in the lot. You didn't have to check on me, I know." A pause. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Why didn't you ever go back to this kind of work? After Mom, you had the skills. People would have hired you." The fluorescent light hummed. Calvin looked at his hands, which were clean because he had learned early that precise work required clean hands even when the work involved nothing that would visibly soil them. "After your mother died," he said, "I went into the shop one morning and I sat down at the instrument I was working on. A Fazioli, a gorgeous thing, a client in Bryn Mawr, and I put my hands on the keys and I couldn't hear it. The way August taught me to hear. Everything was just surface." He paused. "I thought it had gone for good." Mara was quiet. "I called the client and referred him to someone else. And I didn't go back to that level of work, because you can't do this kind of work without that quality of listening, and I wasn't sure I still had it. And now?" He looked at the piano and the clamps. The wood of the case, even dull with age, had a warmth to it that new instruments didn't carry, something about the years accumulating in the grain. "I can hear it," he said. "I've been hearing it all day." A long quiet on her end. "Mom would be glad," Mara said. And then, before he could respond, "I'll leave the porch light on." The third day, Calvin arrived at 6, worked without except for coffee he had brought in a thermos. The bridge cap joint had cured correctly. He removed the clamps at 6:15 and ran his finger along the repair at the fracture terminus and felt the bond close and solid beneath the surface. He would not know if it held under full pitch tension until the stringing was complete, and he would not know that until mid-afternoon. Dennis Carr came by at 9. He stood at the door for a moment and then, without being asked, handed Calvin a replacement hammer butt spring from the center's parts supply. One of the springs Calvin had inspected the previous day had a hairline fatigue crack. Calvin had not mentioned it. Carr had been watching. "Third hammer from the bass break," Carr said. "I saw it," Calvin said. "Thank you." Carr nodded and left. That was the full extent of it, which was the right amount. Adeline came at noon. She stood at the edge of the room in the way she had developed over the past 3 days, not crowding the work but not pretending she wasn't watching it either. "Harmon Delaney's office called this morning," she said. "He's available for a second assessment if you need a consultation." "I don't." She waited. "The bridge repair held," he said. "I'm bringing the instrument up to pitch in stages over the next 4 hours. Voicing starts at 4, assuming the soundboard response is consistent." He set down the tuning hammer and looked at her directly. "I'll be done by this evening." Adeline looked at him the way she had not quite looked at him all week. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "I need to tell you something I found in the center's records." He waited. "Your original service contract for the 1993 season." The final payment, the completion invoice, was never processed. She held a folder. The director who commissioned the work retired in early 1994. The contract fell through the administrative gap. The center owes you for 3 months of seasonal maintenance and the storage preparation service. She opened the folder. With standard interest applied over 31 years, the outstanding amount is $74,000. Calvin set down his tool. That's separate from the grant, she said. It's a liability the institution carries regardless of this week's outcome. He looked at her. I didn't come here over an old invoice. I know you didn't. I'm telling you because it should have been paid. It should have been paid in 1994. She closed the folder. I looked it up because you've been in this room for 3 days and you work like someone who isn't here for the money. He was quiet for a moment. What made you think that? You turned down a credit card advance on the grant disbursement, she said. The other candidate, Harmon, asked for it as a condition of accepting the contract. She set the folder on the lid of the piano. You didn't ask for anything. After she left, Calvin stood alone in the storage room for a few minutes, not working, just standing. He thought about what it meant to start something and not be allowed to finish it. He had prepared this instrument for storage with the intention of returning in a few months when the performance series resumed. The resumption never came. He had carried the fact of the unfinished contract for 30 years without naming it as such, the way a person carries an unresolved thing until the moment it finds its resolution and they understand suddenly what it weighed. He picked up the tuning hammer and continued. The voicing was done by 8 in the evening. Calvin played a single scale from the lowest A to the highest, listening not to the notes but to what was underneath them, the evenness of the sustain, the transition between registers, the way the treble carried in the particular acoustics of the storage room, which was not the same as the main hall but was enough to verify what he needed to verify. The piano sounded like itself, specifically like the instrument he had known in 1993, but with 30 additional years in its character, a depth in the mid-range that had not been there before, the particular quality of wood that has been under tension for decades and has, in some physical sense, memorized that pressure. He played 3 notes in the upper register, listened to them decay, and then sat still. He called Mara. "It's done," he said. A brief silence. "It's done? It's done, Dad." She laughed, a short, genuine sound. "Are you still there, at the center? Packing up, I'll warm up dinner." A pause. "How does it sound?" He thought about how to answer that. "Like it's been waiting," he said. 30 years, and it sounds like it's been waiting. The gala was on Saturday evening. Calvin was not expected to attend, but he arrived 30 minutes before the doors opened and stood in the main hall while the caterers arranged tables and the lighting crew adjusted the stage wash. The Steinway had been moved from the storage room to the performance platform the previous afternoon, and it sat under the hall's overhead lights with the kind of presence that instruments carry when they are the right instrument in the right room. He walked to it and opened the lid and looked at the strings. Then he sat on the bench and adjusted the distance and put both hands on the keys. He played 4 bars of a Schubert impromptu, quietly the way you test a room before anyone is in it. The sound went up into the ceiling of the hall and came back changed, the way sound does in a room built for it, fuller and longer-tailed than it had been in the storage space. Adeline found him there. She stood at the edge of the platform and listened until he lifted his hands. "I didn't know you played," she said. "I don't," he said, "not properly, not anymore." He stood up. "August said you couldn't work on an instrument you couldn't play. So I learned enough." She looked at the piano. "The board made a decision this morning about the grant." He waited. $250 as agreed. "And the outstanding service balance also as agreed." She paused. "The board also voted to offer you the center's instrument maintenance contract, going forward full concert season, your schedule, your terms." She met his eyes. "We have 6 instruments in regular rotation. The Model D makes 7, assuming it stays in the active inventory." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "You're keeping it. We're keeping it." She looked at the piano. "It would be a different question if it sounded like any other concert, Steinway. It doesn't." She glanced at him. "Whatever you did in there, I did what it needed," he said, "in the right order." He left the center as the first guests were arriving. The parking lot was filling, and the November air was cold and clear, the kind of cold that sharpens the smell of everything. He sat in his car for a moment before starting it. He thought about August Voigt's voice, dry and unhurried, saying that most people did not know how to listen to a piano. He thought about the note he had written in 1993 and left inside the key cover, and how it had been waiting there for 31 years, holding a record of the work in its precise, careful terms, because even at 27 he had understood that documentation was a form of trust extended toward the future. He thought about Ellen, who had listened to him talk about instruments for 30 years with genuine interest, and had once told him that the reason he was good at his work was that he respected the things he worked on. Not the money they represented, not the prestige of the venues they sat in, the things themselves. He started the car. Mara was at the kitchen table when he came in, her laptop open, the blue mug from the cabinet in front of her. She looked up at him. "How was it?" "Good," he said. She studied his face. She had her mother's way of doing that, reading what was there without asking for it directly. "What does good mean tonight?" He hung his jacket on the hook by the back door. "It means it's done. It means the thing I left unfinished is finished." Mara closed her laptop. "And then what?" He looked at her and he thought about the 7 instruments he had been turning over in his mind since the drive home from Belmore on Wednesday. A Bosendorfer Imperial at a conservatory in Baltimore, not played in 12 years, reportedly untunable. A Fazioli in a private collection in Connecticut, the same make as the one in Bryn Mawr that he had handed off 14 years ago. Instruments sitting in silence, in cases and under covers, in rooms that had been closed by circumstance, waiting for someone patient enough and knowledgeable enough to sit down and listen. "Then I opened the shop," Calvin said. He went to the back room, he turned on the lamp over the work table and sat down. He opened the binder to the first blank page past the 1993 entries. He uncapped his pen and wrote the date at the top of the page, and below it the serial number of the instrument he had just finished, and below that the opening line of a new set of notes, written in the careful, unhurried hand of a man who understood that what he recorded tonight was the beginning of something rather than the end, and that it deserved to be written as though it mattered. Because it did.